Hello, everyone, and welcome. Thank you for joining us 2022 Energy Code session. As you get settled, a few reminders before we get started. Please do not use the chat box to ask any questions for today's panelists. Instead, use the Q&A. With the Q&A feature, attendees can like a question to move it to the top of the list. And as always, the webinar content and additional resources will be available on the AIA California website shortly after the session. Today's session, focused on electrification measures of the Energy Code, is brought to you by Energy Code ACE. This session qualifies for one AIA HSW learning unit for those who watch live. AIA California staff will report those units for you once you have finished the session. Now I would like to quickly introduce our presenter. Gina Rada is the principal and owner of Gable Associates. She has been in the energy modeling field since 1991. Gina is an energy analyst performing a wide range of responsibilities in both residential and non-residential construction pertaining to compliance standards and energy modeling, and is a respected subject matter expert informing the statewide code development process. Gina, thank you for being here today. I will hand it over to you.
Okay, let's see if I can do this smoothly. Okay, the normal check. Do you see my screen, Rebecca? Okay, let's get started. So thank you guys for having me be here today. I was just talking to Rebecca before we got started about how the interest in what's going on with this next code cycle has skyrocketed. And I think all of us are looking at the calendar going, oh my gosh, in a couple of days, it's going to be October, and this code cycle is coming pretty gosh darn soon. I have to say the requirements for single family are not as earth-shattering as the requirements are in terms of the changes for non-residential construction and multifamily. And we've done many presentations with you guys over this last few months. And if you haven't attended any of those, you might want to check into that if that's the type of work you do. But what I really wanted to do with this session is dive a little bit deeper into what are these new requirements for single family, and what does it mean to the designers and architects, and how they might have to work differently than what they're used to. I'm hoping all of you are comfortable and familiar with everything we have at Energy Code ACE. I'd like to give you an update on what we have available supporting this next code cycle. So we do have the Reference ACE. Reference ACE is a digital copy of the standards plus everything that supports the code. And we just recently added the reference appendices to that code language available through our online tool. The Virtual Compliance Assistant is a tool. It's we kind of call it the TurboTax of filling out the non-residential and multifamily compliance forms of the 2022 code. It does not support single family. So again, if you do that other work, you might want to be aware of that. All of our training is being updated. I'm going to highlight some of the ones that have come out just recently to support our topic today at the end of my presentation. But you might want to make sure to sign up and get on the list of when some of these new classes are coming out that you're interested in the most, so that you can keep on top of things as things are coming out. Our resources are also going through a complete overhaul and supporting the new code cycle. And pretty much every week, a new one is coming out that is supporting all the various occupancies and scopes of work associated with the energy code. But let's get into what we are going to talk about today. I always have to start with the basics, guys. I know some of this is going to be, gosh, she says this every single time. When is the implementation date? It's going to be January 1st. Just in a couple of months, and this is when you go for building permit. So some of us feel like there's going to probably be a rush to the building department in the next couple of months for projects that don't want to be subject to these energy code requirements. Now is the time for you guys to be looking at what's on our plate. What is it that we're going to be doing? And are we prepared for it to go for the next code cycle? And we will talk about what those implications are in this particular content. Or if you are going to want to get in before the end of the year and not be subject to those new requirements. So now is the time, honestly, look at your desk, look at the contracts you have. How are you going to proceed to be able to submit when you want to, meeting your client's desires and wishes? Across the board, we always talk about the mandatory requirements associated with the energy code. These are measures that are found to be cost effective for all 16 climate zones. Doesn't matter where the building is, these will always pay for themselves. They're also not dependent upon scope of work. The requirements don't change for new construction, the least expensive time to integrate energy code requirements, versus alterations, the most expensive time to integrate energy code requirements. Mandatory stays consistent across all of that. Built on top of mandatory requirements are our prescriptive requirements that do change based on climate zone. Is it a hot climate zone? Is it a cold climate zone? And what is cost effective for that location in your building design? And then what is applicable to your scope of work? We will always have new, more aggressive requirements associated with new construction. What's a little bit unique with this code cycle is we saw some pretty tremendous increases in the energy code requirements for alterations specifically associated with roof insulation. So if you guys do alterations or remodels of buildings, you might want to get up to speed on those requirements. We can use the performance approach to provide flexibility of the prescriptive measures only. You're never, ever allowed to trade away mandatory measures, and you do have to use state certified software. Now, when we talk about the software, there's been some changes in how it measures how your design is meeting the goals of California. So in the 2016 code cycle, we measured TDV, time dependent value. What time are you using the energy source? Where are you located in California? Is it really hot outside or is it cold outside? I live here in the Bay Area, and numerous times when the valley is like 110 degrees, the fog rolled in and we're at 65 degrees and our heater's turned on. So location matters in terms of how we're using energy and how we're designing to those energy uses of the location. It also takes into consideration the value, the cost of the energy source being used, whether electricity, natural gas, propane. Currently, the most expensive energy source right now is propane, meaning that if you do anything to a building that's on propane, it's not attached to a natural gas system or infrastructure. Anything you do to save that propane energy gives you more compliance margin than anything you're going to do that saves electricity. So we have to think about this as we're designing and how we're trying to make our project meet the needs of the location and the energy sources being used within the building. In the 2019 code, we changed how we look at the measurement of our building. How are we rating or grading our buildings? And for new construction, they introduced EDR, Energy Design Rating. Now, this is not a new rating to the United States. It's used in many areas through the ResNet system throughout the United States, but California decided to take it and go, you know, we like the idea of people understanding how to grade the buildings, and it makes sense across the states. But we still measure energy differently than everyone else does. We are still measuring energy performance with that TDV multiplier, that math that's going on under the hood. So still unique, though the scoring does look similar to the rest of the United States. For this next code cycle, they're adding a new metric. And what makes this challenging is that all of these metrics must be met individually with very little crossover from one metric to the other. So this new metric is called the Source Energy Design Rating Score. And this is a metric that is measuring your hourly source energy, but just putting on the lens of what's going on with the carbon footprint associated with this energy source. So if we think about electricity, its carbon footprint is at the plant in which we're generating that electricity and it's being transmitted, where we have some losses in the transmission lines, and then that electricity is used on site, but there isn't any additional carbon footprint associated once that electricity is at our site. And we can supplement that electricity with on-site renewable energy sources such as photovoltaics that allow us to have a non-carbon footprint generation on site. Natural gas not only has issues where it's being stored in a remote location, but the transmissions to our single family home to the site, and then we're burning it on site. And there's a lot of carbon associated with burning gas. So when we talk about natural gas, we have major issues with transporting it and burning it. And then we talk about propane, we don't have so much the transmission issues, but we have still the fact that when we burn it on site, we are definitely increasing our carbon footprint. And that's what the source energy design rating is going to be measuring. So if you're going to be using propane or natural gas, immediately you're in the negative. And how are you going to offset that? How are you going to say, okay, we're going to use gas, but we're going to use it so efficiently. And our building is so efficient that it's a small footprint because of how efficient we are. And that might be a means of being able to show compliance using natural or propane gas for our space heating and water heating systems that are dictated by the energy code. But I'm hoping what you're also hearing is that if you use electricity, you won't have the source energy penalty unless you use a lot of it, okay? You are still going to be measured that using a ton of electricity, such as what's used when we use electric resistance, space heating or water heating, is still going to not only give you an efficiency penalty, which we're still measuring, but also a source energy penalty. So we want the right type of energy source being used with the right allotment that makes sense to a standard design, because that's what we're always being compared to when we use the performance approach, is a standard design that represents your footprint, that location that the house is located, but meeting all of the prescriptive requirements spot on. And its associated efficiency metrics and source energy metrics of that standard design, in which it's just beautiful according to the energy code. So these three buckets are going to have to show compliance for that report to say building complies. So I might be passing with source energy and efficiency energy, but my total energy, which takes into account renewable energy sources on site, might not be passing. Then great, you did great with source energy. You're doing not using more than you need to, and you're using a source that has a low carbon footprint. Your efficiency is amazing. You have great windows, you have great insulation, but you don't have enough PV. And that is going to not be a building that complies to the energy code with this next code cycle. So there's layers associated with showing compliance for new construction in the next energy code. Now, I hope you realize that climate zone matters. And this is a tool that's put together by the Energy Commission. I gosh dang love this tool. This is my favorite tool, mainly because it's just so cool. It's the climate zone map layered on top of Google Earth. And you just put in your address, or you put in your city, or you put in the street, however it is you're finding the location of which you're like, we're about to design a home here. I want to get a good idea. What is that climate zone? What is the energy code looking at in terms of efficiency measures and PV sizing that I need to consider before I start designing this home? So great tool out there. I hope you guys are using it already. Such a fun tool. The other thing that's going on out there when we talk about electrification is cities and counties who are deciding to go above state code. And by going above state code, they can never ever water down state code requirements. So nothing can be less stringent. But it's layering additional requirements or adding increased stringency on top of state code. This particular website, localenergycodes.com, is the primary resource to find out what REACH codes or local ordinances have been adopted for the areas around California. And many, many, many cities have adopted electrification as a means to increase their compliance to the carbon reduction goals of California. There are other ways they can adopt REACH codes that go above and beyond code, such as in current code cycle 2019, we do have quite a few cities that are saying for every gas appliance you put into a new building, you're also going to put in the infrastructure for future electric appliances at each of those locations. Reducing water use and really thinking wisely about how we're using water is another way. Information disclosure audits, benchmarking. I haven't seen a lot of that. I haven't seen a lot of cities go in that direction, but cities like San Francisco's like adopted every single one of these different pathways, I got to tell you. And more cities are looking at process loads, especially if they're a city that has a lot of process facilities. What could they do that's outside of the energy code? Because the energy code does not dictate all process loads. What can be done as a local ordinance? So you really want to keep up on your projects. The minute you start a project, you want to go to localenergycodes.com and see what is being required in addition to state code for that area. But you don't want to stop by doing it once, because throughout a code cycle, a city or county can adopt a REACH code. So you might be ready to I'm going to submit to the building department tomorrow, but they dropped a REACH code local ordinance the day before. You are now subject to that local ordinance that you might not have been aware of because you haven't submitted for permit yet. The minute you've submitted for permit, you have locked your time and what is required of you the minute you submitted. So there's definitely a new process in keeping up on speed and aware of REACH codes that are happening in the areas that you're designing in. We are seeing cities now adopting REACH codes for 2022. So I think there's about 5 cities so far that do have REACH codes that they have already adopted that will go into place starting January 1st. And most of them are still of the flavor of, yeah, you still have choices about whether you want to do electrification in the state building code. But in our city, we're not going to open up those choices to natural gas or propane. We want you to stick with electricity. So be aware of the different flavors and what that might do to the design of your building. So let's talk a little bit about what the electrification requirements are going to be for the 2022 code. Now, some of them were foreshadowed with some of the REACH codes that we saw that were adopted by local cities. That is a means and way that the entire process behind building code requirements in California is developed by incentivizing going in a direction that code is looking at. Let's start going here, but we need to have people prepared. We need to have them educated. We need to make sure that we have equipment that is available and that we have contractors who know how to install it. So let's incentivize going early to where code is going. So by the time code gets there, we have a support system in play to support these new measures. So some of these new measures are not going to look and feel new to most of us who have been dealing with cities who have already gone here in previous code cycles, including the 2019 code cycle. So we are definitely moving towards electrification. There was a lot of discussion. There was a lot of emotion about the energy code and electrification. And the energy code has many things that they have to meet via the Warren-Alquist Act, 4 things to become an energy code requirement. And there are a lot of people saying, no gas available anywhere, make it a state code. But the energy code just couldn't do that yet because of a variety of reasons, of which we just don't have time to get into all of that. But electrification is definitely a key resource of how we're meeting our carbon footprint goals and our carbon emissions and air quality and talking about pieces of equipment that might be new to some people. I remember when I was doing mechanical design back in the 80s, that heat pump water heaters were something that were used back in the 80s. This is not brand new to the industry. What's brand new is that the technology has evolved so dramatically. There's so much great equipment out there that now is the time for us to cost effectively and having a lot of product available to those of us who want to consider heat pump. The market's ready. And that's why the Energy Code was able to go here, because the market's ready for this. And we will see that we have requirements associated with heat pump space heating, heat pump water heating, encouraging electric stoves, specifically induction stovetops, and electric resistance or heat pump clothes dryers. So we have to think about what type of project is your project. Is your project an all electric home? There's absolutely no natural gas or propane being used for any feature in that home, because that's the definition of the Energy Code when we say all electric. Or is it a mixed fuel project? And the mixed fuel project is using natural or propane gas for some of the appliances in the building. Now, do be aware, for REACH codes, they sometimes have a different definition of all electric versus mixed use. I have seen some cities say that all electric includes all electric appliances, but will let you have a natural gas fireplace. All electric appliances, except for will let you have a gas cooktop. So do be aware when we talk about all electric, that definition might change based on, is it state code we're talking about, or is it a REACH code, a local ordinance that we're talking about? And when we make decisions about our design, we need to consider fuel sources and the appliances, because you're about to see how it's going to affect how you design the building. So let's talk about what the prescriptive requirements are for heat pump water heating. It varies on climate zone. So here, all of California, the desire is to go to heat pump water heating. But there are some, shall we say, leniency measures associated with, well, if you want to use some natural gas, we'll talk about, well, what climate zone are you and what's that source? What are you using it for? And you will see here that in climate zones 3, 4, 13, and 14, of which I've highlighted in a lighter yellow, you can use gas tankless water heating in those climate zones prescriptively if you so desire, as long as you're using a heat pump space heater. If you will see that heat pump space heaters are only prescriptively required in those climate zones, you get some flexibility for water heating because you're using a heat pump space heater. You know, Rebecca, there is someone's not muted, and it is causing a little bit of background noise. If we could just make sure everyone is muted who does not want to speak out loud or have us hear their background noise, that'd be great. I'm getting a little distracted, sorry. Bright, shiny noises. So in climate zones 3, 4, 13, and 14, space heating is prescriptively required to be heat pump. And if you go there and you don't do a performance exception to that heat pump space heating, you do have the ability to look at using gas tankless water heaters if you so desire. Oops, I didn't mean to do that. That particular slide has some funkiness to it. Looking at both using prescriptive heat pump water heating, which we'd like to have everywhere, but we'll give you some leniency in 3, 4, 13, and 14, depending upon your HVAC system. Across the board, everything's going to look better in your performance calculations using heat pump technology because of your source energy metric that's associated with this next code. So I have someone asked a question, what is the source of the electrical power? There's not enough now. So our utilities have their own goals they have to meet set by state code of what their portfolio looks like that's generating electricity. And we've all seen that we've had some strains on the system as we've been converting our system to more of a renewable energy source so that electricity is green and it's not burning natural gas as much, because we still do have quite a few natural gas plants here in California, but the utilities again have their goals to start converting those and providing more energy sources to their portfolio that are that have no carbon footprint. So what we're trying to do with the buildings that you're building is, hey, your building's here and it's going to last what, 50, 60, 75 years. And the utility sources and our grid is going to get greener and greener and greener on a much faster pace than your building being rebuilt or having these mechanical systems replaced. And we are always looking at how much electricity we're using. That's why building efficiency is so important when we talk about this picture. What the state is not saying is carte blanche, use as much electricity as you so desire. Woohoo, amazing energy source, go for it. No, we still have grid harmonization issues that we need to consider, and how best are we producing, using, and transferring that electricity up and down the state of California, which is why the energy code has gone heat pump technology, because that is a very efficient way of using electricity to generate heating energy. And you will see that if you want to use any other electric source, or like I said earlier, when we look at that source energy, the more electricity you're using, you have a house that has a ton of windows and a hot climate zone, you're using a lot more of your you're using more of your allowance for air conditioning than the code allows, and you have to offset that somehow. How are you still maintaining a small footprint on when and how you're using that electricity? Okay. So Brad is saying no carbon on site. What about all the batteries we're charging, et cetera? What I wanted to, and I'm Brad, you weren't listening to every single word I said very carefully. Carbon generated on site. Yes, there's a carbon footprint associated with manufacturing them and retiring them, but I was talking about on site, and that's what we're looking at. And battery is a major component of how California is going to help support that grid harmonization, that issue, the question we had of there's not enough electricity now. Well, there's quite a lot of electricity generated for parts of the day with all our PV systems that we have. But as soon as the sun starts going down or it's wintertime, we don't have as much production, and we have to use it wisely. And maybe that wise use is storing it instead of losing it. And we'll see that we have code requirements that are looking into what we call grid harmonization and storing of energy, even though, yes, Brad, it does come at some environmental cost. Building a building comes at an environmental cost. And those are things that we have to consider. Let's talk a little bit deeper about those heat pump space heating systems. As I said, in climate zones 3, 4, 13, and 14, they are going to be prescriptively required, but across the board, when you use the performance approach and you want to use gas space heating, it will affect your source energy metric. And one of the tools that they have given us, and it actually happened mid-code cycle for the 2019 code cycle, is a variable capacity heat pump performance compliance option. And I really wanted to talk about this with you guys about design considerations, things that maybe you might want to do some research in and find out more about, because for these variable capacity systems that meet a very specific design criteria, and here's our design criteria that has to be met, that each habitable room has to be directly served by a ducted or ductless indoor system. All habitable spaces that exceed 150 square feet are going to have a thermostat that control the environment of that space. So we have to be thinking consciously of what's a habitable space in my building, what is a non-habitable space, what's the size, and how am I giving its own control system of how it's maintaining its temperature. And this entire thing is verified by a HERS rater. But going back here, this credit is only engaged in the performance approach. and it's pretty humongous. I gotta tell you, I've been able to provide a lot of compliance flexibility for projects by looking at a variable capacity heat pump system, which is most commonly provided via mini split systems. So really look into mini split systems and variable refrigerant flow systems. So there is technology out there that is pretty amazing, and it's not expensive. It's not like a hydronic space heating system in which I've got warm floors throughout my entire house. That's a pretty expensive system. This isn't, and provides, because of its ability to spot cool, shall we say, specific rooms when the people in the room going, hey, I'm setting the temperature because I'm here in this room using it and I want to be comfortable. But I'm not sleeping in my bedroom right now, so I'm not going to set the temperatures there. I'm going to make sure those are temperatures in which I'm not using more energy than I really need to. So a really great tool that they've given to us under our belt. A little bit more about water heating. There are many different types of heat pump water heaters, so you're going to have to do research on heat pump water heaters. 240 volt heat pump water heaters is what's really supported by the energy code, because it has a quick recovery rate. It can produce that hot water ready for that next person that's going to take a long shower quickly. But there are a lot of people who are getting very concerned with how much load do they have in their homes, and how can we think about the design of the loads of the home by taking into consideration, do we really need a 240 volt water heater? Maybe 120 volt will work, depending upon the desires of the homeowners of when and how much water they need. The solar backup system. So this is a PV system that's tied to and dedicated to an electric resistance water heater. So I don't have any flue, and it's a pretty amazing system. Does need to be an approved system by the Energy Commission, but I've seen some of these are pretty amazing, and I'm seeing them quite often used with ADUs. Now, you do have some exceptions to the heat pump water heater. Remember that if you want to go gas tankless and not take a penalty, in climate zones 3, 4, 13, and 14, that is possible, but that means you are using a heat pump space heater. This other exception kind of shocked the heebie-jeebies out of me, that they brought this into the energy code. I've been talking about how electric resistance is bad, and I still think it's bad. It's not a good use of our energy sources. But if you have a brand new dwelling unit, this does not apply to alterations. This is a brand new dwelling unit, and it's 500 square feet or less of conditioned floor area, and you are able to successfully get a HERS verified point of use distribution. All of the appliances that are using that hot water are within a certain distance of the water heating source. You can use an instantaneous electric resistance water heater. So it's not all the time everywhere. It's for a very small dwelling unit that's brand new. And they did put in some language, hey, if it's a 1-bedroom new dwelling unit building, that 120 volt heat pump water heater, there's going to be no penalty associated with that, because it's not going to be working super hard to do recovery, because we're just serving a space that only has 1 bedroom. There are so many resources out there about, I forget what Redwood Energy calls it. I think it's energy diet or something like that, about how to look at your loads, think about putting certain features on a diet so that you can minimize the loads associated with your electric systems. Now, one of the values of heat pump water heaters is, you'll hear that a lot of us call them batteries, because of the fact that we can push electricity that's being generated in the middle of the day, when typically most of us are at work and we're not using hot water, but that's when our photovoltaic systems are generating electricity, and we want to store that energy somewhere. We don't always want to put it back on the grid. We want to use it, and that's what the energy code wants you to do. They want you to size a PV system for use of that home only, and not to also serve the grid. They really don't want you pushing electricity on the grid, and that you're thinking of ways of using that energy and or storing that energy. And we can, what I like to call, overcharge our heat pump water heaters, heat them up to 140 degrees. And then when we come home and we start using our water heaters in the evenings or even that next morning, because they're so tight, they're so energy efficient, they're not losing much energy at all by sitting there, which old technology gas water heaters do, that you have stored your energy by heating your hot water during the middle of the day. And these are features that are encouraged by the energy code by giving you some extra credit compliance flexibility for having some load shifting appliances in the home, along with a PV system with certain controls that you're promising, such as a heat pump water heater. Now, where we're talking about electrification, part of the big push for electrification, and I'm assuming this is a crowd I don't need to tell this to, is about the health factors associated with burning gas within a home. And a lot of concentration has happened regarding that indoor air quality associated with cooking. So what's also brand new to this code cycle is that your airflow of your kitchen hood will differ based on whether you have an electric cooktop or a gas cooktop. And if you have a gas cooktop, your airflow requirements are going to be higher. We want to bring that air out. We want to flush out that kitchen with more air changes than if that same hood was serving an electric cooktop. So do be aware, if we're using gas cooktops, we will have alternative requirements for our kitchen hoods, which will require a higher airflow rating, which will be verified by a HERS rater. Now, if you want to use natural gas anywhere in the home, let's say you successfully were able to go, I want a natural gas water heater. And I was able to, in that performance approach with increased building efficiency and so forth, and showing that my source energy is in compliance to how much I'm allowed, I pass. Yay. You do that with the furnace. You do that because you want a gas cooktop. You have a gas dryer. But that means you're going to put in an electric infrastructure for future electric appliances. So if you're going to put in that gas tankless water heater, this is an issue. All of you need to be considering this. You need to design into the home a 2.5 by 2.5 by 7 foot space that is accessible for a future tank heat pump water heater. And part of what you're also going to put in that 2.5 by 2.5 by 7 foot space that you reserved is the electrical infrastructure for an easy install of that heat pump water heater. And if the space you reserved is within 3 feet of the water heater that's there, that gas water heater, you have one set of requirements versus you decided to reserve that space that greater than 3 feet from where the water heater is. And this is in part because the further away the water heater is from that hot water piping, you're adding more energy load as we have to flow through the hot water pipes longer to get the hot water to the source. So there is going to be a cost and a design criteria behind wanting to go gas tankless water heaters. If you're going to put in a gas furnace, you're going to have to put in the electrical infrastructure for a future heat pump space heating system. Cooktops, same also. And here you'll see that what you're required is to have a 50 amp feed circuit for that future cooktop. That's to support an induction cooktop. All the rest of these are 30 amp. Even here, the water heater is 20 amp if it's within 3 feet of the existing water heater that's being installed. You go up to 30 amp the minute it's a little bit further away. The rest of these are 30 amp except for the cooktop. So, being conscious of what does that mean to the electrical infrastructure of the home, to the service size to the home, and the cost. So you're paying, the homeowner's paying for 2 services, gas and electricity. That's a cost. Is it a cost that they really truly are conscious of? Is a decision they're making. And you, the designers, need to be helping support that. So Emery's asking, how loud are the exterior components for heat pump water heating systems? Worry about neighbors complaining. So I put in a variable heat pump system. I'm going to say it out loud. I use Mitsubishi. I really love their products. I'm not supposed to say particular things, but there's a Daikon and Fujitsu. They all have great products out there, but I just know my experience with mine. I can barely hear it. Yeah, I'll go out there and I'll hear more of a swooshing noise because there's a big fan associated with it. So also be aware there's fan and there it is pushing out cold air. So we really need to think about where we're putting these systems because they are pushing out cold air as they're drawing out the heat from the air. And my neighbor has an air conditioner that squeals and is so freaking loud every single time they turn it on. And I can never open up my windows if they have their air conditioner on, but that is not the case for my heat pump space heater and my outdoor unit. Now there's lots of products out there, but in my experience, because that technology has evolved and the industry is ready, it's pretty amazing. It's pretty good stuff there. What will the utilities be using for constant base load generation? There's a lot about our portfolio. I'm not going to get into deeply here because this was all about designing a home for electrification. A lot of our portfolio currently right now is natural gas, but we have had goals at a state level. Remember I said at a state level, the utilities have renewable energy goals they have to meet, and the utilities have exceeded those goals, which I think is 40% of the portfolio being provided with renewable energy. So, and they have to by 2050, but you have to be 100%. So there's some aggressive goals happening on that side of the fence regarding what is the generation of the electricity that we're using. Bruce is asking, emergency generators, can they still be used? Yes, they can still be used. And in fact, in some areas and some building types, you have to because of the electric issues, the electrical grid issues we've had in California. But consider if we're designing the home right and we're putting in potentially battery storage that can work off the grid when the grid goes down, and maybe that might be enough and we might not need gas generators. Do be aware gas generators are subject to the air requirements of California. And I'm not an expert on that, but they do have requirements, not in the energy code, but in terms of the air quality requirements in California. Okay, what was the turbo? I'll talk about that again at the end, Matthew. And Bruce is asking, will there be limits to reduced mega mansion size single family homes? There already are limits, Bruce. The limits are based on it's relatively complex, I got to tell you, of what it's based on. And it's based a lot on code development and these prototype buildings we use, and that are the basis of what that standard building is. Now, the software will match your footprint of the building, but it will not match your window configuration. It will keep the window configuration to a 20% window to floor ratio. It will also, the allotment of certain energy uses will be based on these prototype buildings, which it's a 2,000 square foot house. Do be aware there are also some cities that have reach codes that if your building exceeds a certain square footage, you have even more you have to do to be able to build that building in that area. Marin has some pretty aggressive requirements that are dependent upon the size of the building. Maya is saying that the heat pump water heater does create a lot of cold air. And this is, and I kind of started the conversation and didn't start it. With heat pump water heating, there are many different configurations of where you can put that heat pump water heater. One, the condenser can be included with the tank like we're seeing here in this picture. And then we really want to consider that we want to vent out that, shall I say, exhaust air directly to the outdoors, because if it's the middle of winter and I'm exhausting that cold rejection air to within the dwelling conditioned floor area, I'm now making my space heaters work a heck of a lot harder, and that is not the intent of the energy code whatsoever. Design matters, getting the right equipment based on the location. You also have heat pump water heaters in which the condenser is detached from the tank. So that condenser that's rejecting cold air is outside the home, but the tank is inside the home. And the tank location is important because we want to maintain the temperature that we're working so very hard to produce. So we do not want to put the tank in a cold environment such as outside. The energy code doesn't disallow you from doing that, but you will be taking a penalty in your performance calculations if you choose to put the tank of your heat pump water heating system outside an enclosed space. Questions about, hey, how about Tahoe? So in climate zone 1 and climate zone 16, there are some flexibility measures that we consider. And climate zone 1 up close to as much north as we kind of have here in California, but against the coast, so we don't have that much freezing. And 16 you can see is like anywhere that snow stays on the ground. There are some leniency associated with these climate zones based on standard equipment, but there is some great cold temperature heat pump equipment out there. And if you're going to be designing in 16, 14, climate zone 10, these are areas where it gets really pretty cold in the wintertime, and we're thinking about heat pump technology, thinking about placement of that technology, and thinking about the right technology for the application, and really looking into the cold environment systems that are out there. So I jumped around a bit here. So what I want to do now is move on and start talking about our solar and battery requirements of this next code cycle, and go back and handle some of the questions I potentially haven't answered yet. Okay, so let's talk about PV. But before we can talk about PV, we have to talk about SARA. And SARA is the available solar access roof area associated with the site. Current code, we only look at the roof of your conditioned building, and that's it. We don't look past that roof, even though you could put the PV system anywhere you want on the site. This next code, we look at SARA, and that includes not only the roof of your conditioned building, but any roofs associated with covered parking areas, carports, any other buildings that are being built in conjunction with that permit, such as a detached garage, a storage shed, a separate pool building. All of those building roofs are looked at to see if they can structurally support a PV system, and they are considered as where and what we have available for a PV system. Now, what we don't include in our available area are areas of those roofs on the site that cannot show they have at least 70% annual solar access. So over the course of the entire year, as the sun is going over that location, that they have at least 70% of the year they've got good sun. If it's less than 70%, then we don't include those areas. And if you think about a heavily wooded lot, potentially PV might not be required. And this does apply to current code if we can show with a CEC approved solar access tool, and we looked at that whole site and we looked at where the roofs are going to be. So we do some stuff where we put a drawing of that future roof and where it's located and its height and all of that stuff in our tools to see, are you going to have enough sun? And do you have at least 80 contiguous square feet of all these locations that can support 70 or greater % annual solar access? Occupied roofs as specified by the building code are exempt. I don't really see that being too much of an issue with our single family buildings, though I do think that'll come up more often for multifamily. And any roofs that are not available because we need that area with no PV to be compliant with other building code requirements. The issue is it has to be approved by the executive director. That is a pretty onerous process in which you have to get your permit. You have to have a permit number to be able to submit to the Energy Commission, because the Energy Commission is the executive director, that you really truly have a valid exception of, hey, I can't put PV here. Now, there is discussion at the CEC of putting out a pre-approved executive directive list, such as the fire code access requirements around PV. We can't cover the entire roof of PV. The fire code doesn't allow that. Egress requirements that we have around mechanical systems. We also always want to consider that any shaded areas, if I have obstructions, those obstructions are taken into consideration in terms of, do I have that greater than 70% annual solar access of the space? So I had someone say, hey, could you please post the solar access tool? I can't multitask that well. So that might be something that I provide after the fact. But if you go to the CEC website and you just put into the search pattern solar access tools, it will take you to the site that lists all of the current approved solar access tools. There's at least, I think, 6 or 7 of them now, and they're adding to them all the time. I got to tell you, I'm an Aurora fan. That's what we use here in our office because it really allows me to bring in that future roof design into the site and look at how is the sun going over that site. But there are other tools. Heliotrope is another really popular one that I've seen. Thank you so much for someone who provided that link. I very much appreciate that. And, you know, you're either going to do this yourself or you're going to hire someone to do it. I'm an energy consultant. This is a service I provide to my clients of doing the solar access report of the site using their roof design of the project to take into consideration, are we exempt from PV? Not only are we exempt, but where's the best location for it? Now let's talk about when we don't need to have PV, even though we have great annual solar access, okay? So this would be because of high snow loads that have been dictated by the local authority having jurisdiction, that there are structural issues if you put PV in certain areas of their jurisdiction. So you do need to check with your jurisdiction. There is not across the board, hey, you have snow, you're exempt. Because an example is Truckee. There are areas of Truckee in which the snow load exception will exempt you from PV, even if you have amazing annual solar access. But there are many areas of Truckee that you are not exempt, and you will have to provide that PV system, even though it does snow sometimes. So please, please, please check with the authority having jurisdiction about exceptions associated with snow loads. There's a brand new exception for this next code cycle that if we do the calculations and that standard design, remember that one we're always competing against, that's the perfect prescriptive building. If that standard design says, hey, you don't need more than 1.8, you have less than 1.8 kWdc required as your minimum PV size, you are now exempt from PV for that building. It's not based on your proposed PV kW number. This is all about the standard design. And if by chance you go prescriptive, I really don't talk prescriptive because it's not how most people, 99.9% of the people out there do compliance for new construction, but there is a methodology, a formula for the prescriptive method also. Now, this is going to be a very small footprint. So this is all about ADUs. ADUs are small homes, tiny homes that have a very small conditioned floor area in a mild climate zone that might then give you that exception. So a lot of people ask me, what is the PVKW based on? Because it's not a big number. And that PVKW is based on, and here we are, we're going to talk about mixed fuel home. In fact, part of what we're trying to move away from in California is a mixed fuel home, but to keep things fair and to not overwhelm the grid with PVKW production, because that's a major part of the development of the code, is not only how are you designing your site, but how is it affecting the grid and supporting grid harmonization. So it is based on a mixed fuel home, so it will not take into consideration the energy use of a heat pump space heater or a heat pump water heater. It only takes into consideration the electric use of your air conditioning and some other appliances, and kind of looks at building efficiency too. there are different ways we can go about promising our PV design. I don't want to do the PV design now. It's going to be done as a deferred submittal. It's going to be done under a separate permit. There are different ways we can do it. I really don't want to think about it right now. But you have to have that PV considered when you go in for your building permit, and it has to be installed before the final occupancy permit. And there are different promises we can make. I'll promise that we'll put PV anywhere between 150 and 270 degrees on the site because I have great roof access for that. You get a smaller PV kW size if you use that methodology. Or you might say, you know, I need more flexibility than that, and I'm not going to narrow myself down so much, and I'm going to promise between 105 and 300 degrees of north. So there are different ways you're going to think about how do I think of and design in my PV design. You can locate your PV anywhere on the property, as long as it's that property that it's associated with. It can't be the neighbor's property. You can lease or purchase the PV. You can be part of a CEC community shared PV system. Currently, the only one approved is in the SMUD territory, but it can't be because you promised to invest in a green program. I get that asked a lot. That's not an exception. What do we need to consider when we think about PV design? Well, the energy code's requirements is a little teeny PV kW like this big. What else might you want to consider now that we have the investment on PV on site? What are the loads should you consider? EV, electric vehicles, pools, spas. They have 100 TVs. What is it about how they use their property that we might want to take into consideration? We size our PV systems. Oversized systems, if you oversize it so much where the local utility says, whoa, you went way bigger than what we're able to handle, and there is a formula put in place by the CPUC of which once you exceed that formula, the local utility can say, we're not going to pay you back for any unused energy because you are putting a system on your site that's way too big to your needs. So do be aware, oversizing is a thing and it's not encouraged. Get your PV contractors and or designers involved early. I'm hoping you're seeing, even when we're trying to figure out the best place to put a building on the property, we should be thinking PV. When we're thinking about roof design and the orientation of our different roof surfaces, PV should be considered. Now, battery ready is brand new to this code cycle, and it's very similar to electric ready. It's not that battery has to be installed. It's that we are setting up that home and for a future battery system by making sure the electrical infrastructure is in place. They have the ability to decide how they're going to use their battery. They have two design options, and they're making sure the infrastructure of what outlets are being served by the battery when the electricity goes down and the battery ramps up, what is being used in the home. You've saved enough space for that battery, and you have an electric infrastructure that can support it, okay? Currently, right now, you can take credit for installing a battery. Currently in the 2022 code cycle, you can take credit for installing a battery. And you don't get that credit until the battery is at least 5 kWh or larger. And it also then, if you have an installed battery, you don't need to meet the battery ready requirements. So there might be that cost, hey, we don't have to do the battery ready. And that's a cost because we're already doing it. And then it gives us some flexibility in our performance calculations. Things you need to be aware of when you're thinking about where is this battery going to be located? Where is the battery ready requirements? Where am I going to save a space? Think about your occupancy in the allowed locations by the building code and the fire code. Think about how the fire code has requirements in terms of the fire detection associated with the technology and the size of the battery. And ventilation of these battery systems is very important, as is dictated by the mechanical code. So when we're talking battery, the energy code introduces the subject, but then we need to be aware of all the building code requirements, residential code, fire code, mechanical code, that are going to dictate the design parameters. Now, there are criteria specific to the energy code, again, about what type of future system and how they use that future battery system they might choose. They use one or the other. What circuits must be prepared to be served by that future battery? And here's a big one. The main panel has to be a minimum 225 amps. And this does apply to ADUs, newly constructed ADUs. So this can definitely be something we have to consider. There are lots of incentives currently right now. If you want to consider changing out existing gas equipment to heat pumps, so many incentives out there right now. Now's the time to take advantage of them. We have some additional classes on this topic. We have a class that just went live that we really talk about the solar and battery design criteria associated with single family in the 2022 code. And then we look at the whole building, including PV and battery and other building efficiency measures, and our architects class for single family. We have resources available helping you guys get up to speed on this next code cycle. The best thing to do is sign up for an account to be told what's going on. And I'm available after today if you have any questions. And we do have a Survey Monkey, if you guys wouldn't mind telling me what you thought about today. Now, no, I'm like 1 minute past the time. So Rebecca, can I go through the questions for maybe just a few minutes to see if there's any that I can answer, or should we do the rest of these offline?
It's up to you. We do have quite a few folks who have hopped off already. I think we had a lot of folks that needed to head off to a 1 p.m. meeting, but I have alerted that everyone will receive a copy of the questions in the follow-up email. So I can just go ahead and copy all these and send them your way, and then we can go from there.
I think that's a great idea, because there were some questions specifically, tell me more about that virtual compliance assistant tool and this and that. And then I can give people links to all of these resources and things that I am supporting as great resources.
Absolutely. That sounds wonderful. I want to thank you again for this wonderful and informative presentation. For all of those who are still on with us, we will go ahead and submit your transcripts as soon as we can, and we will send you that follow-up email as soon as the production and the answers are all there for us to send out. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Gina. We will see you in November, I believe. November 22nd, we have a multifamily version of this presentation. So we'll see you then.
And a lot of people are asking about it. They're going to get a copy of the slides. Yes, you will. That will be coming your way, along with having that link to the recording available through AIA California.
Awesome. Everyone have a wonderful rest of your afternoon. Thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone.